Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Friday Exchange. I'm delighted today that we're joined by Stan Gilmour and most recently uh, Director of Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit, but before that, a long and distinguished career in policing, and is currently doing lots of work on a number of different themes, which we'll come on to discuss in the course of the conversation. But we're going to have a really good discussion about the nature of policing, about prevention, and talk a bit, I think, also about different ways of looking at serious and organised crime. So lots of different themes and topics. But Stan, the reason for inviting Stan basically is one of the most interesting people that I know in policing, and so it's always a delight to pick his brain and get his thoughts on the state of policing and uh, and uh, uh, and crime and all of the issues around that. So that's great. Now, just in terms of a bit of housekeeping, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, then you can do that. You can either use the Q&A or use the chat function. Sometimes it's easier actually if people just use the chat function. It's a bit easier to manage. So if you just put your question and just do it as we go along. So if we build up a few questions, that's good, and then I can put them to Stan and it keeps the conversation going. So if you if you just have any thoughts or comments on anything that either of us is saying, then do drop them into the chat. I should say we are recording this, and this will be posted on our YouTube channel. So obviously, don't post anything that you don't want to be published on the internet in your name. So just please be aware of that. Great. Well, let's make a start. And Stan, thanks very much for joining us. I wonder if you could start by just telling us about your career and background and how you've ended up where you are now. It'd be great just to start there if we could.
Okay, and I'll be brief. So I served for 30 years with Thames Valley Police in quite a range of different roles, I guess, as many do. So from neighbourhood policing, armed policing, organised crime, major crime, public protection, CID, counter-terrorism, etc. And I finished my time there, I think, as you've already said, as the director of the Violence Reduction Unit for the Thames Valley. And I guess the thing that propelled me into that slot, I suppose, was the work I'd done previously, looking at complex problem solving within major crime, counter-terrorism, public protection, and as a local area commander. Made me kind of think and look at the world of problem solving perhaps slightly differently than I had for the first half of my career. And we developed ways of working, multi-agency, multi-stakeholder, whole of society, public health. There's all sorts of terms for it, but basically just working with others to get stuff done. Finished up in a multi-agency partnership looking at violence prevention. Since retirement, and for a little time before, I guess, as well, I was involved with different organizations, locally, internationally, globally, looking at those issues of how do public sector work together more effectively with communities for all sorts of different reasons. And when it came to time to retire, I got asked by many of those if I would do some work in support of their aims. So since retirement, I've basically been doing that and working and supporting organizations with their thinking around evidence-based practice, around policing in a global context, around organized crime, around gender and human rights perspectives related to that, violence prevention within that. So I've had really kind of interesting time in the past year since I retired, and was fortunate enough to be asked to be a senior associate fellow with the Police Foundation, and having a great time contributing to that debate as well. So that's me, and I'm really pleased to be here.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Stan. And a lot to dig into there. So I think let's start with this sort of question, and this is something that you and I have spoken about before about what policing is for, and in particular something that you've said to me and others a number of times about the difference between policing and law enforcement. And I just wondered if you could unpack that for us.
Okay. So many use those terms interchangeably, and certainly the work that I've been doing kind of locally, and I think the where it's struck home more is in international work. The term is used interchangeably, but they're two separate things really. Policing encompasses law enforcement, but law enforcement doesn't necessarily encompass policing. And I think a lot of the way that people speak about policing is largely through the lens of law enforcement, as if that's the only thing that policing does or has ever done. And we know from the evidence, including the evidence from history, that law enforcement is a critically important part of policing, but it's not the only part. And if it is, then you end up in quite a bit of trouble when it comes to how you conduct your actions. And we see that across the world, where policing, perhaps as a very kind of state-run organization, is heavily leveraged towards law enforcement and becomes the pointy end of the state, and often state oppression. So I think when we speak about policing as being law enforcement, and when we privilege that over all of the other things that policing in the UK does, then I think we start to become quite perilously close to a tipping point that we don't want to be at. My view is that policing and the role of constable within policing is a very kind of unique characteristic of British policing that allows us to keep that Britishness within policing, which is that we're there to do much more than law enforcement. And I think we don't speak about it enough. We don't discuss the importance of it enough, including the role that it has within balancing our constitution. And I think that we need to spend a lot more time looking at what policing is for and what policing does, rather than just imagining it through the lens of law enforcement and going down that route.
And do you what's the sort of do you think there's a connection between that idea of policing and all of these discussions about public trust and confidence in the police, so that well, I mean, yeah, do you think there's a connection there, and could you explain what you might think about that?
Well, yeah. So if we kind of start with, if law enforcement is the lens, if you will, then you're looking to enforce the criminal law. And then you say, well, what is the criminal law? What's it for? What does it do? Well, it sets a benchmark for what non-typical behavior looks like that ought to also be criminal, and then it allocates a punishment for people that trespass on them. So the criminal law is to set a benchmark and to punish. Doesn't do anything else. The criminal justice system hopefully meters that out in a way that is just and in a way that is procedurally just, and policing has a large role to play in that. But when you take away the large role that policing has to play in just policing, as it were, with a capital J, then you end up with enforcing punishment on the population to a benchmark that's been agreed by Parliament. And I think that's one of the areas where things become tricky, because you start to then lose discretion, you start to lose that ability to form relationships and partnerships with others to look at prevention more clearly, because the criminal law, there is an element that sits behind it that seeks to be preventive, but the criminal law is not preventive. Criminal law is for punishment. So I think we need to look a bit wider than just law enforcement to think, well, how do we do this in a way that makes sure that communities that are marginalized or made vulnerable for different reasons don't end up as you often hear, over-policed and underprotected.
And you started to talk there about prevention, and I know this is obviously through your work at the VRU and but also in all the other work that you've done. This has been a big theme that you've been working on and thinking about. Uh, what do you think? What do you think needs to happen for us to have a properly serious approach to prevention of harm, crime, however we want to frame it. But um, what are the things that we need to do as a society or as a local area in order to get really preventative?
Um, the first thing is there's tons of really good stuff going on. And again, in the work I do overseas, I can see that the UK is really kind of leading in so many ways on this in the way that they're thinking about it. There's also fabulous stuff going on overseas that we can learn a lot from. And the common themes really are about building relationships with communities, and there's lots of and partners. There's lots of evidence that would support that actually things work better when you're working within those confident relationships with others. And we know that the evidence base is quite critical of simplistic views of how you prevent crime. But it also has a really good lead into what works well and problem solving under whatever guise, i.e. working with communities and partners to tackle those issues that make people vulnerable, that make people open to exploitation and criminalization. Those are the things that we ought to be focusing on preventing bad stuff happening in, rather than picking things up far too late, when there's lots of victims being created and lots of people being exploited and abused. So earlier intervention with partners and other organizations that are able to start to close the gaps in the needs that people have, those needs that make them vulnerable to criminalization. So yeah, working early on in the chain with communities and others to solve the problems that sit behind issues that express themselves as crime.
And a lot of people talk about public health approaches. I mean,
Yeah.
could you say something about that? Because sometimes people say to me, what does it mean to take a public health approach? And I just wonder what your take on that is.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things that you speak to 5 people and you'll get 6 opinions on what it means. But largely I distill it down to working in multi-agency partnerships with the community at the centre, thinking how you can solve some of the problems that I say make people vulnerable earlier on, and focusing your attention on prevention rather than on court. And that's generally, I mean, there are other ways to express it. There are much longer ways of talking about it, and there are depths that you can go into. But largely, it's whole of society, multi-agency approaches to early intervention and prevention is the way that I would style it. And you can do it in different ways. You can do it through problem solving, or you can do it through any of the other frameworks that have been developed. But as long as the focus is on early intervention and prevention, and it's on support and making sure that people get the support they need to fill the gaps that are so often there. We talk about vulnerability as being a systemic issue. People are vulnerable when they can't access the services or the support they need to thrive or keep themselves or their families safe. We often talk about vulnerable people and vulnerable communities. Well, nothing particularly distinctively personal about those issues, so long as they've got the support and services they need to manage them. So when we talk about vulnerable people or populations, generally people or populations that services don't meet the needs of effectively. And so often that goes along with poverty, marginalization, etc. So public health approach really is saying that we need to pay attention to those people that we may just dismiss as being vulnerable, or we may just dismiss as being in a minority. And we need to consider why services aren't meeting their needs, and then try and fill those gaps in a more effective and less expensive, frankly, way early on, rather than letting things build up into high harm and high expense later on down the road.
And I wonder if I know that when you were at the VRU in Thames Valley, you did a lot of quite groundbreaking work on bringing together data. And I wonder if you could say something about that, because I mean, typically that's the thing that gets thrown up as being the biggest obstacle. Is people don't want to share their data. It's very difficult to therefore get a full picture of harm, vulnerability, risk, all of this stuff in a local area. Could you say a bit about how you approach that in Thames Valley?
Sure. Well, collaborating on data is as difficult as collaborating on anything else, and we often, I often talk about collaboration as being working together and not together apart, because I've seen so many collaborations over the years where people come together once a week, once a month, once a quarter, once a year, and discuss what they've been doing whilst they've been apart. And that doesn't seem to me to be my view of collaboration. That seems to be, briefing people at touching points rather than actually really working together in integrated ways. And in order to do that, you need to understand the demands that are there on other organization and the needs of the communities you're there to serve. And really, there's only one way of doing that, which is taking the information from many different sources to allow you to build a picture. Because, how do you know whether Stan Gilmour's at risk? Well, the school might tell you something and say, but he is turning up at school and he looks okay. And the police might say, well, yeah, he's doing that, but there's all this going on in his background. And health might say, yeah, that's going on, but there's also these other things. And it's not until you get that combined picture, and everybody understands this, it's not until you get that combined picture that you start to see that actually Stan's not turned up at school today, and that is something we should all really worry about. So how do you do that? Well, I often talk about it as being a hearts and minds issue, because in your mind, collaboration makes sense because it's about working together to achieve something. And that's the first definition of collaboration, if you will. But why doesn't it happen is generally the second definition of collaboration, which is treasonous cooperation with the enemy. and everybody worries about that. So when you say to people, should we collaborate? Every report I've ever read says we need to collaborate more, share information more to prevent harm. Everyone agrees with that. And when I say, well, can I have your data? Nobody wants to do it. So it's getting the hearts and minds in the same place. And one of the things we did and are still doing really, and others are trying to do the same, is to work out the technology, the governance that needs to sit around it, and the mechanism to hold a partnership together on data and data sharing for public good. And that work continues, but we're making globally significant steps being made in that direction, but still a long way to go before we move away from data sharing or file sharing into a full data collaboration. And we will get there, I know, because we have to, but it's there's hard yards there still to be won.
And is it about, I mean, at the heart of this, is it about the sort of, people's perception of risk, so they're sort of thinking, if I don't share, nothing can go wrong because I've got my data sort of bolted down in the basement. But if I share it, then it's out of my control, and then I'm subject to. So I mean, that's at the core of this, isn't
it? That is. When I speak to people about why they're nervous about sharing data, it's generally speaking because they don't want to get into trouble. Regardless of where the conversation starts, the conversation might start at, well, we don't want to, make these, we'd only share these data with people and make them more vulnerable. And then when you get over that, you get down to the heart of it, it generally is, but we are scared that if we agree to this and sign up and do it, we will be in trouble. So that's why the governance and the technology and the partnership work, all these three things hand in glove really are important because most data strategies are data protection strategies. You ask somebody, can I see your data strategy, please? And it's largely about how you protect people's data, which is hugely, hugely, hugely important. But it doesn't include the second part, which is how do you mobilize those data for public good to protect people? And that's generally absent from a data strategy. So what we're trying to do is balance that out and say, okay, many of the things I get asked is, what's the ethical argument for sharing data? And that's much easier to answer than the other question is, what's the ethical argument for not sharing data? And I struggle to get people to tell me that other than, well, we're too frightened to do it. And I'm hugely summarizing here. There are obviously good concerns that we need to be very clearly aware of and doing things about. But largely we can overcome those concerns through technology and governance and a strong partnership. And that's kind of where we ought to be moving towards, I think. And the Information Commissioner's Office, I wouldn't say agrees, but they've published some guidance on 10 things to think about to share information safely for safeguarding. And they're very clear within that you need to have a good multi-agency picture of risk. Otherwise, you're just sharing information on harm. And of course, we want to get there before the harm, which means wider sharing of information. But that's a hearts and minds issue. And we're making progress.
Yeah, well, that's good. Well, that's good to hear. I mean, one of the things this has just got me thinking about is that I was talking to some people about we've got a lot of multi-agency working in the system, and there's an awful lot of multi-agency meetings, which is often about sharing information about a person or of concern. And someone was saying to me, um, you know, there's a sometimes there might be a bit of a disproportionate emphasis on sharing the information in the meeting rather than but then the meeting not resulting in anyone taking any action to actually do something with the person. So in other words, there's a bit of just
Briefing the meeting.
yeah, there's or people kind of feeling that we ought to be sharing information, and that by doing that we're almost fulfilling our duty to the person. But do we actually have enough capacity in the system for the right person then to to talk to the individual that or to point them in the right direction? I mean, is that do you think that's an issue?
Yeah, and I guess there's a few things in there. So one, people often say, well, we will share information when there is risk of harm to a child, for example. And then my question is, well, how do you know there's risk of harm? And generally speaking, it's because something harmful has happened that triggers a response. And you're like, well, this isn't risk of harm, this is harm. A child has been harmed, and now you're saying we need to share information. Well, that's kind of a bit too late. And then that leads into the second point about, well, what would an earlier sharing of information do in order to identify some things, some steps that you might want to take to prevent that harm from happening? And is there enough capacity in the system to actually meet those needs? And this is where, again, there's a sticking point. You say, well, if we get better at identifying risk, then it will swamp the system, it will overcome the system, because there'll be too much risk there to deal with. So we just deal with harm, and then we deal with harm above a threshold, because actually we can't deal with all harm. We have to deal with quite serious harm, and that threshold gets higher and higher as the money gets lower and lower. But that's because most focus, you mentioned the public health approach later, is on that kind of tertiary prevention where harm is already happening and we need to respond to it. What we can do by rebalancing the system, by paying more attention and doing more about earlier problems, is you can start to deprofessionalize the system. You can start to lean more heavily on community assets to do things that are preventive early on before you need to bring professionals in to deal with the higher harm issues. And I think that's a slightly longer term focus, but we do need to be able to articulate how you can do this without swamping the system. And the payback that people get from providing you with their information needs to be a very clear payback. If you give us your data, if you give us your information, in return, we will provide you directly or indirectly with these benefits. And that's a point I think needs clearer articulation and a core narrative other than just a kind of strategic aim or agreement. We need to get down into the really kind of core operational things to say. I often say this is when somebody rings a number, who's going to pick it up and do something? And that's what you need to articulate through the whole kind of data architecture is, so what happens?
Yeah. Great. And just a reminder to people, if you have any questions or you want to make a comment, then do just put it in the chat and I can put those to Stan during the course of the conversation. The a related point I wanted to touch on was around how how you see there's a whole sort of landscape emerging of partnership working and different sort of structures that have been put in place. And I'm thinking, so we now have VRUs, and it looks like they're going to expand the VRUs to other areas. We obviously have the community safety partnerships, which sort of exist at the local authority level as well. And then you have a whole series of kind of health partnerships and other things which are in and around the system. I mean, um, uh, do you do you think that landscape needs some decluttering, or is it too complex, or is it just inevitable that given that you're trying to get lots of different sectors to sort of collaborate, that it is going to be a bit complicated because you couldn't have like, I don't know, one partnership that did everything. so you end up with these kind of multiple things. But I guess so one thing is it too cluttered? And another is there a danger that you have a kind of almost like silo working, but with different partnerships working on different bits of the problem?
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know how we solve that longer term, but anyway, I can make some suggestions. But one of the issues that we have when people try to deconflict that is that you end up with public health people working in the police. Rather than saying, well, why don't we just leave it to public health? Why do we then try and do this? Why don't we just collaborate rather than reinvent their role within our organization? So you can see attempts being made, but I think you also have to kind of question whether that is, the right thing to do in the longer term. So kind of, de-siloing by kind of repeating activities within silos seems to me to be a problem. So, the kind of broader issue of this, and I got asked this years ago. I got asked how I join things up on the front line between government departments. And my kind of point then, and it's still the same point, is I wouldn't have to if you were more joined up at the centre.
Right.
So if there was more of a collaboration at the centre on meeting the kind of health and well-being needs of communities, then at the front line you wouldn't have to try and figure out how you knit things together that are funded and inspected and ruled by policy from different kind of stovepipes, if you will. And that comes down to legislation as well, which becomes complicated for data sharing because the legislation allows different silos to gather different information for different purposes. And then when you try and combine that into a picture around supporting community safety, health and well-being, you come up against the kind of the friction points with those legislative gateways. So I think yes, we do need those kind of multi-agency partnerships that we have. They serve purpose, they're focused on different things largely, but if you have a collaborative data picture that supports them, a capability that supports all of them, that is that single data collaboration, then those become products from that collaboration that are managed through a governance system that seems apt. But without that collaborated data joining those things together, things remain in those stovepipes. And it does seem to be cluttered and there's often repetition, but I think that's because there isn't a clear picture of how those things support and collaborate with other things that you're trying to do within the whole system. So I don't think it'll be until we get that clear collaborative picture from data, that you'll start to be able to say, well, if we do this, you won't have to do that, and it'll bring those collaborations together.
Do you think, I mean, just bringing this back to policing, do you
Yeah.
think that um, what does getting more preventative mean for the cops, right? Because they're so even so in a world where you have much greater data sharing and you're trying to take a much more preventative approach, um, what what is the role of the police in it? What are the things that they specifically with their policing role? What do they bring to the party?
Well, police are great conveners, aren't they? Well, that's certainly my experience. We can convene many a partnership between, all of our publics, really, because, generally speaking, the police have a role to play in all of those different areas, whether it's health or well-being or safety. And it's difficult to disentangle some of that. If you say, well, we're not going to respond to calls that are largely about mental health crisis, well, you probably have to know whether it is mental health crisis or whether it's domestic abuse, as an example. So often you're finding out things kind of too late to be able to do much about it to be preventive, and you're starting from too late a position. Because we know from looking at the risk factors that the police are there at the birth of many of those risk factors, even if you take it back to a strict law enforcement perspective. So I think the way that police can do this is to focus on the evidence base, to be working in ways that are evidenced as being worthy of investment. Problem solving is a key one in there. Problem solving is about understanding the root causes, working with partners in the community to get things right. And I think if you follow the evidence base around problem solving, you're not going to be too far off base. We know that the police have to respond to calls for service, and we know that there's some difficulty within that around, what is and what is not a matter for policing, but better data would enable you to see what the clearer picture is on that. So I think investing in good data to understand whether you're the right responder or not, and even if you're not, being able to kind of track what happens afterwards is not a bad thing to aim for. Police are very good at investigation, clearly, very kind of core role for policing, but it's not always joined up across the kind of life course, if you will. So being able to find out whether actually the work you're doing has benefit for others as well, in, for example, family courts, whatever, information that you gather through an investigation that is really useful for other partners to understand how they can best respond to those issues. Police are really good at doing that as well. And police data, by and large, there are exceptions, but they are exceptions. Police data, by and large, is really good data and really useful for other partners to be able to understand how they could best structure some of their services as well. So I think collaboration, working in partnership, understanding that there are things that you intrinsically need to do, but doing them in smarter ways because you're better informed, is the future. And the way that technology is developing, the way that our partnerships are developing, all seem to be pushing us more into that direction. But we need to hold fast to policing and not move too far into law enforcement territory as a single issue.
We got a question from Claire, which I'll just put to you, which is Claire says, "For my PhD, I'm researching the role of the public in crime prevention through environmental design. Most strategies in this field rely on them as a capable guardian. This is rely on the public as a capable guardian. But in my experience, they often don't know they have a part to play, and in modern times, they would prefer not to be involved due to repercussions, etc. Do you have any views on this reliance on the public in terms of their part to play in preventing crime?"
Yes. There's also a role for capable guardians within kind of social prevention as well, because we'd often say that actually the lack of capable guardian, and in adverse childhood experience kind of terms, it's the available adult who's the capable guardian, and that doesn't have to be a parent. So it is about, rather about responsibilizing the public, and we've been through this kind of debate in the early 2000s, and over relying on the public. I think there's a role, and we see these conversations around the world now, and really, in a real kind of hot way within discussions in the Metropolitan Police at the moment, as well as others, is that trusting relationship that policing can often have at a local level, even if it's not very well spoken about. Building that trusting relationship so people have the confidence to be able to, and the knowledge to be able to provide capable guardianship is a really important thing. And I think it works beyond environmental design into the kind of social sphere as well. So I don't think we should say, well, it's up to you, but I think there is a role for us all to play within that kind of social contract. And that's why I get slightly anxious when we go down the law and order, law enforcement route, because it breaks away from that social contract that says, actually, you're part of this, and you're not just you're not just the means, you actually are the ends of this, and we need to be able to discuss with you how you perform that role and how you're supposed to do it and how you're confident in the way that you do it. So I wouldn't say over to you, but I would say this is how it all works together. And certainly the narrative around policing is, citizens in uniform. Again, if you make policing too different from the public, then you kind of lose that narrative as well.
Yeah, really good. And we got a question from Bob Blemmings from PSNI, who is asking, how do we bridge the gap between maintaining the operational independence of statutory agencies such as the police, courts, health service, whilst trying to achieve cross-departmental collaboration? There is a tension between sharing data, targets, partnership working, and still arguing for your own funding stream from central or local government.
Yeah, no, I have full sympathy for that, Bob. When we talk about integrating services, that's usually the thing that comes out, is to say, well, are you going to be spending my budget? So it relies on good governance, and that's why I always talk about these things in those terms, that the techniques for data, for example, technology is one thing, as difficult as it is, governance is another, as intractable as it is. The partnership is, those relationships are a third part of it. So I think you need to say it's one thing will not fix all of this. You need to have the confidence that maybe somebody else is going to be spending a bit of your budget, but actually you've got a return that you're going to see on that, and you're going to be able to measure it. And people often say to me, well, you can't measure prevention. And I say, well, you can't measure it if you're not measuring it. And because most people haven't figured out how to measure prevention, and it doesn't get measured, then they can't see the contributions that are being made from different organizations. So it's really difficult, to the point of being almost impossible, but it is something that we need to keep working on, and being able to articulate how we perform our role within that whole community focus, and being able to articulate that clearly in support of the aims that all organizations have, and see this as a social outcome that we're aiming for. This is our part in it. We have a joint outcomes framework that we know how we contribute to it. And actually policing, if policing does the law enforcement part of it, this is going to come unstuck, because the people that we're trying to reach will be whatever. There's a debate at the moment about pregnant women going into prison, for example, and you say, well, maybe that's not something we want to do because it has a greater impact on social cohesion and social harm. So maybe if we changed our focus this way slightly, we did this with them, things would come out better. And it's having those conversations and having that evidence that allows you to say, well, we need to change the way we're working, and we need to be confident that if somebody else is trespassing on what would traditionally be our sphere, we understand why, we understand what we're doing, and we can measure the outcomes. And again, that's why we need good data to provide that analysis.
Yeah, so because this is classically one of the challenges, is people say, well, how do we we don't know how to measure it, the success of prevention. But from what you're saying, you've seen effective ways of doing that in your experience.
Just to Bob's kind of point, I guess. So if we say if you look at the evidence on kind of risk factors for criminalisation, one of the kind of key risk factors is parental incarceration. So we know that you are much more likely, as a child, you're much more likely to be involved in conflict with justice and go to prison if you have experienced parental incarceration in your early life. So the first question there then is, if you're trying to be preventive, is okay, how many children in my area are impacted by parental incarceration? And who's got the data on that? And there is no data on that. Nobody collects data on parental incarceration. There's no national framework for this. So you have to then say, well, we need to collaborate and we need to get data from different sources in order to piece together that puzzle, identify the children who are at risk, and then find out a way of supporting those children, not through a professionalized kind of public service pathway, because frankly we can't afford it, but through something that's much more community based, but is effective and moderates that risk factor down to zero, hopefully, to make sure that children are not exposed to exploitation or incarceration themselves in later life. And that's where police, courts, and health service can work together effectively to identify and to do something about those risk factors in a way that is measurable and good value for money. So that's just one example of many where those kind of collaborations work really well.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you say there, because I think there's you're right that once things get really bad and you're into those kind of professional interventions, which are quite complex, you're dealing with issues that become quite acute and difficult. That is all quite sort of costly and difficult to do. But you're right. Actually, whenever I look at sort of things people are saying about effective intervention, effective sort of early interventions, none of them look that complicated. You know what I mean? There are lots of things that actually look sort of actually look fairly straightforward, but the problem is the system hasn't been mobilized to do them, and so then things get missed, and then things get worse.
And people get knocked off the program. So you might have a really good program to deal with somebody, but something will happen in their life, another organization will do something, and they'll be removed from that pathway. And that's not for any nefarious reason, they're just doing their job. But things aren't joined up enough to know that actually what they're doing now is a lot less harmful than what they were doing a month ago. And you've just knocked them back to zero by your actions. So it is about being a much more joined up on and more evidence-based on what those interventions look like and how you can maintain people in those interventions, even if it's not a straight path for them. And you can only do that if you know what's happening with them, and you can only know if you're sharing information with your partners. So, that's why I'm really kind of keen to focus on that, because it does underpin so much of preventive action.
Yeah. And one thing that just to sort of shift the topic slightly. So one thing I know you've been working on a lot recently is around organised crime, and particularly around gender. And I just wondered if you could say a bit about what you've been doing and why the focus on that.
Okay. Well, I got involved in kind of academic work around organised crime 20 years ago when I was working in organised crime myself. But I'm now a professor, an honorary professor at Keele University and a research fellow at Exeter, and so I do a lot more academic work now than I ever did. But we've got a few books out on organised crime, transnational organised crime in politics. Together with Philia Allam, who I've been writing with for a couple of decades from University of Bath. And one of the things that we identified from the research and the work we were doing, and it came to light through the data that I was looking at around prevention, was that women are really underserved by data, and when you're trying to find out risk factors affecting girls, you really kind of struggle to articulate it well through the data, because for whatever reason, and we can speculate, girls' data doesn't seem to make it through into prevention in the way that it ought. And that translated across to the work we were doing in organised crime to say, well, actually, when you look deeply into organised crime, you see women within organised crime in all sorts of roles, including senior roles. And often it's articulated as, well, their brother went to prison and they stepped forward. And you think, well, did they? Or were maybe they always running the business and it's just that their brother was the front face of it and nobody really realized who was the mastermind, as it were. So we did some research with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, across kind of Northern Hemisphere countries to try and understand whether women were playing kind of key roles within organized crime. And we found largely that the problems were similar in most countries, where nobody really had good disaggregated data, nobody was really thinking about it. But when we started unpicking things, we saw that the prevalence rates were really quite high, anything from kind of 10% up to nearly 50% in some kind of thematic areas. So we produced a report, and I helped produce a toolkit for the UN on how to think more clearly about women's roles within organised crime, but they're equally relevant to other areas. And to say if we were to give women full agency, as we ought to do, and see them as full humans and not just girlfriends or wives, I wonder how that might change our perception on the roles that women play, and therefore the support that they get to exit from those situations. And the scenario that we often hear is, riding a tiger's back. They want to get off the back of the tiger, organized crime, but they don't want to get eaten by it. So how do you provide pathways for women to exit organized crime if you're not paying full attention to their roles? And you see that in other areas where you'll say, well, 70% of knife crime is kind of young men in these areas, so we're going to focus on that. Now, that seems eminently sensible. But if 30% isn't, what's happening to them? And that's a big chunk of humanity. So what we're trying to do through the work that we've been delivering is to kind of encourage organizations to think more clearly about girls and women, provide data on them that we can then start to base our interventions on, because as things stand, interventions are based around male data. And that is not always effective for girls and women, because again, the evidence will show polyvictimization of girls, much more intense issues for girls as they age than there are for boys, and much less intervention early on. And this speaks into the whole violence against women and girls agenda as well. So yeah, really trying to focus back on those issues.
And would you, I mean, one thing that's sort of been brought up is, and I know some in the sort of VRU world have been sort of discussing this, that initially when the government set all of that up, it was this very, the way the government framed it anyway, was this was about knife crime. And I guess people automatically have in their head men and boys committing both as victims and offenders. But I know that some VRUs have tried to have a sort of broader scope, and for example, looking at domestic abuse, and it strikes me that if you look at, for example, obviously we don't know what's going to happen in the general election, but if there is a change of government, it's quite noticeable that Yvette Cooper's been talking about having a big push on violence against women and girls and trying to reduce quite substantially the levels. I'm just wondering, is that something that you think the VRUs should be encompassing? That they should have a broader, as broad a view of violence as possible. That they're trying to encompass not just knife crime, as serious as it is, but also looking at violence against women and girls.
So I think the serious violence strategy from 2018 that kind of set the agenda, if you will, for violence reduction units, gave a kind of good list of risk factors to sit behind serious violence. And although you're right, the emphasis was very much on, violence affecting young people in public places, specifically knife crime. That was the kind of core of the work. When you start to unpick that and say, well, why? and the point I always push is it's not what violence is, it's what violence does that is the issue. So when you start to look at why those young people are in the street with knives attacking each other, then you start to move into those areas where the risk factors point you towards. Many of them are around domestic abuse, neglect, violence within their kind of life history. So you need to start tackling those issues if you're going to say we're going to be preventive. And that takes you into all of those different spaces. Now, I mentioned earlier about the multi-agency partnerships that already exist, and you have to say, well, who's best placed to do this? Is it a violence against women and girls, framework and strategy and multi-agency group that's focused on that specifically, or is it the VRUs? And I think the answer is there's probably room for both, because the VRUs, if they're looking at capability, the role of VRUs to provide leadership and strategic coordination of local efforts. Yeah, so they should be there with violence against women and girls, safeguarding, community safety, health and well-being, trying to coordinate that activity rather than say, well, they're focused on one kind of thematic area. So they can provide a really good coordinating, convening, operating model, if you will, data repository, resource, background information, in order to make those things flourish. And I think that's probably the best place for them to be, looking widely on what serious violence does, and then how the systems that are in place to deal with them can work more effectively together with their publics.
Yeah, no, really interesting. Well, look, I mean, Stan, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon, and thank you for sort of sharing your thoughts on all of those issues. And I think we've had a really rich conversation, and it's probably one that is worth viewing again. And I may well view it again because I'm doing some work on prevention at the moment, which so this conversation has been very, very helpful. But very, very helpful both in terms of conceptually thinking about it, but also in terms of what actually might work and what are the sort of building blocks to making this difficult stuff sort of happen. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you all of you for logging on, and for being with us this afternoon. We are doing another of these soon, and I'm just going to look up to see if I can find the next one. We have got Sarah Charman. So our next one is on the 19th of April, with Professor Sarah Charman, who, if you don't know, is professor at Portsmouth University, and she has been doing lots of really good work on policing, and particularly looking at how police officers experience their roles, and she's got some really interesting research on that. And so we'll be having a really good conversation about that. Specifically, recently she's been doing some stuff on retention, which I know is a big issue in policing. So if you're interested in that, how the police can retain people as well as recruit them, then Sarah's got some really interesting findings. So we'll be doing that next month. And then we've got a whole series of other Friday exchanges coming up. I think we've got Neil Basu, former Assistant Commissioner at the Met, is joining us. We've got some really interesting psychologists are joining us who've been doing some really interesting work on police culture, which I think will be really good value. So do keep an eye on our social media feeds, and we'll let you know the dates for all of those. But in the meantime, thanks very much to Stan for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.